My name is Yasmin, and I'm from Gaza and Jaffa in Palestine and Cairo in Egypt.
My name is Jeanine. I'm from Hattin and Tarshiha in Palestine and Beirut in Lebanon.
And my name is Faris, and I'm from Al Khalil in Bir Sabah, and you've tuned into Diaspora Discussion, the show where we center Palestinian voices on the topic of Palestine. And today, I want to discuss a few things with you guys. I want to get onto the organization that you guys work with later on. It's an organization that has been in the limelight a lot recently. But I want to start with your respective Nakba stories, if you guys don't mind. Maybe we'll start with you, Yasmin, first. You're half Egyptian, half Palestinian.
Yes.
And I'm sure the Nakba story kind of delves into that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So my grandparents are from Jaffa, specifically Manshiyat Jaffa. But we had family in Gaza from before the Nakba. So in the process of the Nakba in the early months of 1948, they were displaced from their home. They moved down a few streets in Jaffa, and then eventually they fled to Gaza, to the rest of the family. And my grandmother actually grew up in Rafah al-Masriya, like in Rafah, but on the Egyptian side. In the 50s, she witnessed the 1956 war in Egypt. And in the early 60s, my grandparents got married and moved to Kuwait because my grandfather was one of the beneficiaries of like the scholarships that the Egyptian government was offering at the time to Palestinians, especially in Gaza. And he studied medicine, became a doctor, like classic like story of like one child gets educated, lifts the entire family out of poverty in the aftermath of the Nakba. And then my mom was born in the 60s there. And in the 90s, when there was an invasion of Kuwait, a lot of the entire Palestinian community in Kuwait basically was decimated. But because my family was Egyptian, like wathiqa, like ID holders, they actually couldn't leave Kuwait. It was very difficult for them to leave. So my family is like one of the like few thousand Palestinians that remained in Kuwait after the early 90s. But my mom couldn't continue her studies, so she came here. And my dad, even though it might not seem as obvious, like he migrated here in the 90s, might not seem as obvious as like a direct result of the Zionist project, but because of the economic reality in Egypt, it's a different consequence, I guess, of the Zionist project. So he migrated here in the 90s and they met in the mid-90s, and I was born here in the north of England. So that's my Nakba story.
Did at any point your family, your Palestinian family, experience the refugee camps in Gaza?
Not like a formal refugee camp, no, because my grandma's family lived in like a informal camp, like in Rafah, that didn't continue to exist. And in the 60s, she left. But my extended family in Gaza did, yeah, in the south. But I don't know which one specifically, again, because of the consequences of the Nakba. And I've never visited Palestine, like I've never been to Gaza or the West Bank, but my mom has. The last time she was there was in the 80s. Yeah.
Oh.
My dad is Palestinian. My grandma is from Tarshiha, which is a town just outside of Akka. And
Our last guest actually was from Tarshiha.
Oh, really? Who was it?
Mohammed Saleh.
Oh, yeah, nice. And then, yeah, my grandfather is from a village called Hattin, which is famously where Salah ad-Din defeated the Crusaders and liberated Jerusalem. During the Nakba, they were exiled to Syria. So my grandma was about 6 at the time, I think, and my grandfather was around 16. And they, were exiled to Aleppo, to Mukhaym al-Nerab, a refugee camp there, which is where they grew up and where they met and where they got married and where my dad and all of his siblings were born. My grandfather and actually on my grandma, both of us on both sides, we have family that stayed in Palestine. So my great-grandmother, even though Hattin was completely depopulated, my great-grandmother, so my granddad's mum, was from a nearby town called Dajish. which was not depopulated. And so my great-grandparents actually moved there after the Nakba, and they died there, and they're buried there. And last time I went to Palestine, I've been twice. Last time I went to Palestine, I got to visit their graves, which was a pretty moving experience. So that's on my dad's side. And then when my dad was a kid, my grandfather, similar story to Yasmin, actually, he went to university and managed to get a degree and lift the family out of poverty, and they ended up moving to Bahrain, which is where my dad spent his teenage years. And my mom is Lebanese from Beirut, and obviously also as a product of the of Zionism. There was a war in Lebanon in the 80s, and so she was a teacher, and so she left to work at a school in Bahrain, and that's where my parents met, and that's where they got married. And that's where I was born. I was born stateless, so Lebanese women can't pass on citizenship to their children. It can only pass through paternal lines, and my dad remained stateless, and so I was born stateless. And a few years later, when I was about 6 years old, we moved to Australia for a few years to basically get a passport, and then we moved back to the Gulf. So that's my Nakba story.
Can you tell us a bit more about the Palestinian experience in Lebanon? Because this is something actually that we don't shed a lot of light on.
Yeah, I mean, in the aftermath of the Nakba, there was, exile. People were exiled, Palestinians were exiled to Lebanon and to Jordan and to Syria, some to Iraq. And I think that, we can look at the conditions of Palestinians in those places today as kind of like almost like an indication of what it meant for there to be a mass migration of Palestinians in 1948 to those places. So in Lebanon, for example, the demographic balance has always been fragile in Lebanon, and there was a big exile of Palestinians, majority Muslim Palestinians. The Lebanese state was really concerned about what that was going to mean for the demographic balance of Lebanon. And so the Palestinians that arrived in Lebanon were left to languish in the camps. The camps had very poor infrastructure, and what that meant in practice was that there was a lot of revolutionary potential in those camps. After Black September and the PLO was pushed or was forced to flee Jordan and ended up in Lebanon. The poor living conditions of the camps basically meant that Palestinians could not rely on the state infrastructure in Lebanon and had to build their own infrastructure in the camps. So you see, women's centers, and you see, childcare centers, and you see all of this infrastructure that was built by the Palestinians that were exiled into Lebanon, and that basically created almost like a cradle or like a baseline infrastructure for there to be a revolutionary spirit and revolutionary potential in Lebanon, and that infrastructure exists to today. Actually, like as part of the Palestinian Youth Movement, a couple of years ago, Yasmin and I went on a delegation to Lebanon to kind of visit the camps, and you really see the legacy of this infrastructure that was built continuing today, and all these centers that are supporting women and supporting children and supporting families in the camps, continuing to do that today and enable the Palestinian community in Lebanon to be self-sufficient despite the lack of support from the Lebanese state and ruling class of Lebanon.
And it's not just the fact that they didn't have any support with regards to infrastructure. It's also the fact that there are 70 odd jobs or positions that Palestinians in Lebanon cannot work.
Yeah, exactly. So there's certain occupations and certain things at university that Lebanese people, Palestinian people in Lebanon cannot study. So medicine, for example, is one of them, and there's a few other occupations that Palestinians are not allowed to work in, and it's shocking. I have, like I mentioned, I have family that remains in Palestine. I have cousins, like distant cousins that, you know, live in 48 and are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And, you know, one of my distant cousins is a doctor, but she also was not allowed to study, you know, within the Zionist entity as a doctor. She went and studied in Eastern Europe, and then came back. And so, you know, you see these policies in Lebanon of Palestinians not being able to study certain occupations and study certain things as actually mirroring what we're seeing, you know, the policies of the Zionist entity as. So, yeah, it goes to show, you know, the conditions of Palestinians, whether it's in the camps or in the diaspora or in 48, you know, they're not as material, the consequences of the Nakba are not as materially different as maybe we might think that they are.
I'd like to ask you both about your experiences with identity, because you're both, you know, quote unquote mixed. I mean, this term of mixed identity might be a bit of a kind of a modern era thing. You know, I'm sure hundreds of years ago, it's not really Lebanon and Palestine or Egypt and Palestine. There's not really that much of a difference.
Yeah.
But maybe we start with you, Yasmin. What does, or how has your kind of your experiences, the Nakba, the fact that you mix, how does that all add up to what you consider your identity or your experience with identity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, yeah, exactly. It's like a very, I guess, contemporary idea that like we really kind of see essentially the project of dividing the region into different states, like cement in a way in terms of when it comes to identity. But at the same time, like reflecting on my own experience, I grew up with both of my parents like really centering and cementing the significance of the Palestinian struggle. Like we grew up, you know, obviously watching the news with our parents and stuff. So I don't think I ever felt like, I guess, like a tension or a contradiction in my identity or anything like that. I think like the challenges like growing up are like to do with, you know, if the years of my childhood that I spent in the West and like, you know, the racism and Islamophobia that you experience and like the questions and stuff that you grow up with. But at the same time, I think that really forced me essentially to like learn my people's history and learn the history of this country as well, and like why they were present in Palestine, why they were present in Egypt. And so, yeah, I think the way that I also think about my Egyptian side is that ultimately like the fate of the people of Egypt is like intimately connected with the fate of the people of Palestine. And so I like sometimes we joke about this idea of like, you know, my dad is Egyptian, but he's like really politically Palestinian because like he understands that obviously the fate of his people, our family in Egypt, is like intimately tied to like my family that's still in Palestine, you know? Yeah.
With the Egyptians, I feel like they are famously nationalistic.
Yeah.
And in some Palestinian circles, there's a bit of negative sentiment towards Egyptians because of, you know, especially with what's going on in Gaza, there is a feeling that they've been let down by Egypt.
Yeah.
And although the government is responsible, you know, that feeling, you know, it kind of trickles down towards the people. Is that a kind of a, I know you said you don't feel any tension with identity, but did you feel any tension there specifically in terms of?
Honestly, no, because I think that I think it's important to think about why the response from the people in Egypt has looked the way it has. With like yesterday, actually, I was watching footage from the 2011 revolution when Egyptian masses like stormed the Israeli embassy in Cairo and tore it down, and it was shut down. And that was like a central aspect of that uprising. And it's because even though like, you know, we say that the slogan of the uprising was like "Aish Hurriya Adala Ijtimaiya," like bread, freedom, and social justice. They understood that those demands, even though they might seem like at first sight like intimately just connected to like the everyday conditions of people in Egypt, they understood that the reason why those basic needs, those basic things that people need to survive don't exist in Egypt because of the Zionist entity. And so that connection was really obvious. And I think that, you know, when I go to visit my family in Egypt, and when I was there in Egypt recently, like it is, it's really confronting to see like the levels of poverty that exist in the country today, and the kind of the erasure of like all the signs of the uprising, the erasure of like the long history of resistance, like the first defeat, however critical we might be of like the 1973 war, the first defeat that the Zionist state experienced was on the hands of the Egyptian state. And like obviously that's we could spend hours discussing that war, but there was something that happened then that speaks to the fact that like there is like a history that there is a strong attempt to suppress in terms of the Egyptian people actually resisting the Zionist project. And what we see today, and potentially like what we might think of as like the masses of Egypt essentially not doing enough like to support people in Gaza, needs to be understood within that wider framework of essentially like 50 years of war being waged on the Egyptian state and the Egyptian people to stop them from being able to, rise up in a moment like this. Because people forget that actually a lot of the uprisings that happened in 2010 in the Arab region were only possible because of the kind of social networks that were built because of Arab solidarity during the Second Intifada in Palestine. And so those things have always been like really connected, and we have a responsibility to remember that and to think about like how can we ensure that the Zionist dream of isolating the Palestinian struggle from the rest of the region never materializes, never becomes a reality.
Jeanine, what's your experience with that?
I mean, I grew up in like a household that like really believed in the project of Greater Syria. Like my parents both, like this idea of like Blad al-Sham was like something that I really grew up with. I mean, my dad is like Palestinian Syrian. My mum is Lebanese. My grandparents on my Palestinian side had a house in Syria. My surname is Hurani. Huran is actually like a mountain in Syria. And so like our descendants, even though that's my Palestinian side, our descendants come from what is now known as Syria at
Ancestors.
a time when that wasn't, those borders didn't exist. And so, in the 2006 Israeli war in Lebanon, I was in Lebanon at the time visiting my grandma, and we ended up, seeking refuge. Like we fled to my grandparents' house in Syria. So, the interconnectedness of the region has always been really like instilled in me from a really young age. And it actually was like more like outside of the household amongst like other Arabs, where I felt like this like idea of like, I don't want to say like purity or like blood quantum, but this like idea of like, oh yeah, you're half this and half that, and whatever was actually like instilled in me. And I think that did kind of produce a little bit of like an insecurity, or like desire to like prove something, like a desire to like prove my Palestinianness, even though like when my mum, like when she was growing up in Lebanon, like a lot of her friends at the school she went to were Palestinian who lived in the camps. And as a young adult, or like as a teenager, when I would meet those friends, they would say stuff to me like, oh yeah, like your mom is like actually more Palestinian than we are, because she also, like similar to your dad, like she always felt like politically Palestinian, and that the cause was something that was really close to her. And I think that actually like in the Palestinian Youth Movement, we're an Arab membership organization, and sometimes people find that a bit strange about, why do we understand the Palestinian struggle as an Arab struggle? And I think that being in the PYM and studying the history of Palestine really helped me overcome that insecurity, and helped me understand like the fact that Zionism is an enemy to the entire region. And yeah, like Yasmin said, Zionism and imperialism is a project that is trying to fragment our region and our people. And even historically, even before the Nakba, like, you know, in the 36 to 39 Great Arab Revolts, like the key figure in that, or the key figure that sparked that, was Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who was actually a Syrian imam who was residing in Haifa. And so you see this like history and legacy of the regional dimension of our struggle historically and today. And so I think that, yeah, for me, it's always, that's kind of the way in which I grew up and the way in which I continue to kind of understand the struggle today.
When I was in my late teens, I kind of discovered that there was a bit of, I'll say, racism maybe, from certain members of Lebanese society towards the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Did you experience any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think that, like, when it comes to Lebanon, I think that a lot of people reduce problems in Lebanese society to sectarian problems. And, you know, I do think that the way that power operates in Lebanon is on sectarian lines. You know, like the Christian population have always been the upper class, and that is enshrined in the way that politics operates in Lebanon. But I actually think that, like, we really what we're actually seeing is not, in my opinion, or in my analysis, society being divided on sectarian lines, but actually society being divided on class lines. And it just so happens that, you know, sect and class go hand in hand in Lebanon. And so, you know, I think that a lot of the racism that we see against Palestinians in Lebanon is actually based on class. It's based on the fact that the Palestinian refugees are the working class. They are the people that are working in the jobs that, you know, no one else wants to work. They're people that are working in jobs that are being exploited in their labor because they have no proper, you know, documentation. And so I actually think that, like, what we witness in the context of anti-Palestinian racism in from like Lebanese people and a particular class of Lebanese people is actually a form of classism, basically. So I think that, you know, once I understood the Lebanese civil war as more of like a class war than a sectarian war, I started to see how that kind of continues to how we understand how racism and power continues to manifest in and present itself and be operationalized in Lebanon today.
But there would be members of the Christian sect, or whether it's Maronite, Orthodox, whatever, in Lebanon who are from lower class backgrounds.
Yeah, of course. Like, we're not talking, there's always going to be like exceptions to the rule, and there's always going to be like, you know, like Muslims, or let's say specifically like, you know, Palestinians that, you know, are able to climb the ladder, and there's always going to be Christians that are working class and from villages that are working class. But I think we need to think about things at like a system-wide level, and how the infrastructure of Lebanese society and how the infrastructure of, you know, government and the banks and how all of these things function, and how the infrastructure that exists kind of creates these inequalities that exist. And it's the same here. Like, you know, you've got people that are raised in kind of working class backgrounds that are able to like rise out of that and like become rich and become, you know, affluent and then embody the politics and the ideology of that affluent society. And so I think that, you know, there are obviously exceptions to the rule, but I think we need to think about how power operates in a like on a system-wide level.
I want to ask you, Yasmin, about your experience going to Lebanon to the refugee camps.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, it was like my first time properly in Lebanon. I had actually visited Lebanon once in 2016, but it wasn't in Beirut, and it was in the Baqa, and I was visiting actually some Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon, and that was like obviously a very different experience to visiting the Palestinian camps in Lebanon. And also I like going as like a much older person that like has a bit more understanding of the history of the country and stuff. It was definitely probably one of the most important experiences of my life, because I had a general understanding of like the history of the Palestinian revolution in Lebanon, the history of the war, but actually like being there and talking to people and seeing the legacy of the Palestinian revolution was really powerful. I think something that has really stuck with me visiting the camps in Lebanon was, we often hear the slogan like المخيم خزان الثورة, like the camp is like the storage of the revolution, and you could really imagine like what existed in that period that like made the camp such an important site and such a threat to the Zionist entity that they had to make that decision to invade and destroy that infrastructure as much as they could. And I remember actually one of the visits, we were in I think we were in Ain al-Hilwa, and we were talking to a hospital. Like we were just doing a tour in a hospital, so it wasn't like it wasn't like a community center, it wasn't like a women's center, it was just a hospital. And I was just asking one of the nurses, do Palestinian women who live in the Mukhayyam, like if for example you don't have enough beds, or like if they have to leave the camp to go to like another hospital, like is that possible? Like what access do people inside the camp have to like the infrastructure of the state outside of the camp? And what she said to me was that actually a lot of Lebanese women outside of the camp come to the camp to give birth inside the hospital of the camp. And what she said was that actually during the period between the 60s and the 80s, like when especially after like the PLO was exiled to Lebanon, because there was this process of like, okay, we live in these really dire conditions, we need to improve our reality. They not only did the Palestinian people contribute to improving their own lives, but they actually were working really closely with the Lebanese people in Lebanon to actually improve the reality of like everyone in the country. And I think that really shows, this point of like what is in the interest of the Palestinian people is like obviously in direct opposition to like, what the Zionist project is, but actually in favor of the conditions of like the Lebanese people in the country, like the majority of the Lebanese people in the country. And that's not to romanticize like, the reality in the camps is obviously like extremely difficult. And we learned about like the history of like the attempts of the Lebanese state to actually like even grant Palestinian people citizenship, and how that was rejected by the Palestinians because they held on to the right of return. They refused to forget about like their land and their life before being exiled. But yeah, it was definitely, it's especially because my family didn't really experience are not connected to the experience in Lebanon and Jordan. It was I learned so much, and coincidentally it was like a few months before this genocide started. And I actually think I don't think I would have ever been able to understand like why this war of extermination is being waged on the people of Gaza in the same way had I not been to Lebanon like a few months before, and had we not like we met with youth in the mukhayyamat. Like it was just, it was a very powerful experience. And you see like firsthand like the way that the Lebanese state is designed to keep the Palestinians oppressed, to keep like poor Lebanese people oppressed, because they are such a threat to the Zionist state. And
I also think like there's an important lesson for us, or like something that I found really powerful as well was like, like the refugee camps in Lebanon, and I'm sure in other places, like there's still a temporariness to everything. Like even now, 77 years at the time, 76 years after the Nakba, there is still this feeling that like we're only here and it's temporary until we can return. And the way that the camp is kind of like organized is like people are living in areas in specific places in the camp that relate to their villages back home. So say, for example, like we have some family in Ain al-Hilwa. So like, you know, they live in like the area of Ain al-Hilwa that is like for the people from Hittin all live in the same area. If you lived somewhere in Palestine that was like on a mountain, then you might live in like the hill of the camp, so that because, you know, you're trying to emulate what you lost or what you are waiting to return to in Palestine as the conditions of the camp. And I think for us in diaspora and for us in the West, it's sometimes harder to like remember like the promise of return and to like remind yourself of like the temporariness and that we're like organizing to be able to return home to Palestine. And I think what the people of the camps remind us is to not get distracted by, I mean, here, like under, you know, like there's so many in the West in particular, like so many like distractions to try and prevent us from being able to organize for return. And what the people of the camps remind us is the importance of remaining, of you know, holding on to revolutionary optimism, of holding on to the promise of return, and to remain like, to hold on to your conviction to the struggle. And I think that's something that is really powerful and like difficult to emulate and like replicate in the diaspora condition, but is a really important lesson for everyone to remember.
You remind me of, I remember who I was having a conversation with, but they said that like one of the silver linings of being exiled, even though obviously it's terrible, is the fact that so many of us from all parts of Palestine got to meet. You know, and got otherwise we wouldn't have been able, you know, someone would have stayed in their own village, they would have never left, right? And they would have known about, you know, the different areas and spoken to people. And actually that brings me on to a topic I've always found a little interesting, which is accents, right? Because now I'm from Khalil, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Khalili accent. It's very distinct, all right? They like to elongate certain words, but I don't have that accent,
right?
And neither do my parents, even though they both have Khalili kind of influences on their lives. And my grandmother has a Khalili accent. I've got family in Hebron who have that accent, outside Hebron who have that accent. But it's kind of, we've kind of developed a kind of a generic Palestinian accent in a way. And I wonder what your experiences are with, you know, dialects and accents, because you have more than one, I'm guessing, in your own households.
I mean, I can start. I mean, actually, on the topic of accents, like I remember when we were, we visited Saida. I mean, we went to a couple of different mukhayyam. We went to Ain al-Hilwa, and obviously, like entering that mukhayyam was like such a, like it was so jarring because like it's literally like completely walled, and there's like watchtowers and like super militarized, and which is like very different, for example, to Nahr al-Barid. And Nahr al-Barid is like a camp that's like more to the north, and one of the camps that was actually like almost entirely destroyed in I think like 2008, 2009, and was rebuilt, and they rebuilt it in the way to maintain what Jeanine is talking about. Is like this part is like where the people from like X village or like Y village are from. And when we were in Saida, there was like, we were walking through the old town, and there was a Palestinian kid, and he had like a Lebanese accent, and we were talking to him bil-Arabi. He was like, wow, I'm so jealous because you have the Palestinian accent and I don't. And yeah, I mean, when I was a lot younger, I had an Egyptian accent because I don't know, like even my mom actually used to speak to us in an Egyptian accent sometimes, and like it was like the dominant accent at home, especially when we were still living here. But when my family moved to Kuwait and we were living with our extended family, the Palestinian accent became more dominant. But yeah, I think I can do both. Yeah,
you're pretty good actually at code switching between them. Yeah.
There's also the issue of Egyptian media being kind of the dominant force.
Yeah, exactly.
And us all being able to understand basically the Egyptian dialects.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's funny because my dad's from the north of Palestine, and I think like people think he's Lebanese, like when he speaks Arabic, because, you know, Jalil, like the north of Palestine, is not that far from Lebanon. And so like there is like a lot of similarity in the accent. Probably like his accent in Arabic is like more similar to someone from the south of Lebanon than it is to someone from the West Bank. And so people always like, oh yeah, like he has a Lebanese accent, it must be because of like your mom's influence. And or like we say certain words, like we say menshafeh, not bashkir, for example. And like people used to be like, oh yeah, it's because your mom is Lebanese, that's the reason you say that. And I would go home and tell Baba like, oh, like people said that's why. And like, no, like even in the north we say that. Or like I say jiddo not sido, which everyone's like, oh yeah, that's because you're Lebanese. And but that was like, no, even in the north we say jiddo not sido. So it's interesting how like these like regional
Well, we say menshafeh sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mum was like, a menshafeh is different to a bashkir anyway. Like apparently bashkir is
Bashkir's like a smaller one. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah, apparently.
You don't
And I was
use
like,
the-
well, you just don't know Arabic, so that sounds like a you problem. But yeah, so it's interesting. But I know on the point around like, you know, identity crisis, like I do think that sometimes my accent has like resulted in a bit of an identity crisis. Like I do think that, you know, there are times where, you know, like my accent used to be, I don't know it so much anymore, but it used to be like quite Lebanese when I speak Arabic. And yeah, like a lot of like my dad's side of the family would like, you know, say that I sound too Lebanese. And it's because my mum is the one that mostly spoke to us in Arabic. My dad spoke to us more in English for some reason. And you know, like when I would speak to other Palestinians, they would say like, you know, why do you sound so Lebanese? And I'd, you know, I'd you know, clap back and I'd be like, well, actually, like in diaspora, it's like so hard to hold on to our language that you should be encouraging me to speak Arabic regardless of what I sound like, not kind of like trying to poke holes at like, oh yeah, you know, too much kasra, not enough fatha in like different words and whatever. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, yeah, the accent thing, and because also like my dad is Palestinian Syrian, so there's also like some Syrian like influence in the accent too. So yeah, it's interesting. And now my husband is from the West Bank and his mom is from the West Bank, and so there's also like a bit more of like a duffa influence in my accent now. And so there's like a saying بالعربي like مش معروف قرعة أبوها من وين.
Yeah.
Just like no one knows where she's from because her accent is like such a
I like
mix of like
Aratabuha
whatever.
is the
Yeah.
term they use.
Yeah. And my dad actually is bold, so it actually works pretty well as a saying. But yeah, and I feel like that's a very accurate description because I do feel like when I speak Arabic, it's like a bit of a mix of yes, Syrian and Lebanese and different parts of Palestine, kind of all kind of mishmashed together.
Do you feel like Australian has crept into your accent as well? Because I feel like
in English?
No, in Arabic. Because I feel like for the diaspora in Australia, the Australian accent has also crept into the way they say certain Arabic words. For example, like you'd say tata or teta.
Yeah.
They say taita.
Yeah.
Right?
They do. But you know why that is? It's because like, it's actually funny how this happens. So like, the way that they say teta I can't even say it, is actually like very, very typical of an accent in a village in Lebanon that's near Akkar.
Okay.
It's actually a very specific, the village is called Mishmish.
Interesting.
And like almost everyone in Mishmish ended up in Australia and they like intermarried and stuff. And so now like a lot of people that speak Arabic in Australia have like a very specific Mishmish accent, even though they're not even from there, or maybe they have one grandparent that was from there, because they kind of like migrated to Australia, they all intermarried, they held on to the accent. And even, I'm sure if you go to Mishmish now, they don't sound like that anymore. It's like very specific of like probably what people in Mishmish sounded like in like the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
And like that's what they continue to sound like. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, on that point actually, because one of our friends, like she's I mean, it's contested whether she's Palestinian or Lebanese because her village is like on the border, and her family like she speaks the way that like her grandparents spoke like Palestinian / Lebanese, because it's like in that place it's like very similar, I guess. And then she was telling me that actually a lot of the diaspora like in the US is like similar to Australia, in the sense that like they would have learned Arabic like from their grandparents who migrated like, I don't know, 2 generations ago. And so they're like parts of like, I guess, the Palestinian diaspora in the US that speak like, you know, the way like our grandparents would have spoken. And she was asking me for a belt, and she said a word that I do not recognize, that I don't think anyone would have recognized, because it's like just such an old word. And so you have the almost like opposite experience where like some people's like accents get mishmashed, like me and you, and then some people like are speaking the way that like two
what
generations.
Did she say? Like, should I ask? We were in Egypt actually, and she was like, wanted to try on a belt or something, and she was like, should I say it shot jumbaz, something? Definitely not jumbaz, because that's gymnastics, but like like three different words for belt. And she was like, which one should I use?
And I was like, I don't know any of these. Hizam. Like
When you went to Palestine, did you go to Tarshiha?
I did go to Tarshiha, yeah.
I went to Akka once.
Oh, did you?
Nearby, right?
Yeah, it's nearby.
I didn't feel like there was much of a kind of a Lebanese tinge, if you will, to the accent.
Really? Yeah.
But I felt like the people of Akka weren't what I was expecting them to be honest. Because it's in the north of Palestine.
Yeah.
But they look a lot like you would expect them to look Lebanese, so to speak. I don't know.
Yeah.
The typical Lebanese look, right?
Yeah.
But no, they look similar to what Palestinians like in the West Bank or whatever look.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you about your experience in Tarshiha. Like, how was that like for you? Because for me, my experience in Akka, I have to be honest, it was one of the most humiliating days of my life.
Yeah.
Seeing what happened to the Palestinians that stayed and how they're being treated.
Yeah.
So what was it like for you?
So yeah, I went to Jish, and I went to Haddin, and I went to Tarshiha, which all have different sentimental and family like history for different reasons. Tarshiha, the first time I went there, my grandma, Ali Yarhamha, was still alive, and she wasn't with us, but and we didn't know where we were going. We just like got in a car, and we went to Tarshiha, followed the signs, and ended up in Tarshiha. And we ended up at like this main roundabout in like the center of the town of Tarshiha. And we parked the car and we got out and we went to this like corner shop to buy water. And while we were in the corner shop, my dad like took a picture of the roundabout and sent it to my grandma. And she basically like told us, because I think she had told my dad maybe when he was growing up that we lived like near the main roundabout or whatever. And so she basically was like telling him where their house used to be based on the picture that he sent. And at the same time, me and my brothers were at the corner shop buying water. And then we asked the guy, like, he was like, oh, so like, you know, it's not really a tourist destination. So he was like, you know, what are you guys doing here? And we were like, oh, actually, like our grandma's from here. And then he was like, oh, like what family? And we said, Shreh. And he was like, oh yeah, like I know that family. Do you want me to call them and like tell them to come fetch you? And so he like called someone from the same family, and they came and they fetched us and they took us to their house. And it turned out that I think like my grandma and their granddad were cousins or something. And so we went and we like had fruit and we had coffee and we hung out with them and got to know them. And one of the kids, like one of the grandchildren, is around my age. And so we still like keep in touch and we still message. And it was a pretty like touching experience. Like, and we sent pictures back to my grandma, and she found it really moving. And, you know, to be able to like reconnect with someone who had like a parallel, it's almost like, you know, the butterfly effect or like, you know, revolving doors and stuff. It's just like seeing someone who was grandparents is like exact from the same family, but like their grandparents stayed, and my grandma fled, and you know, this like how Zionism has created these like different realities for different people. Haddin was a lot more confronting. Haddin was it was completely depopulated. I am assuming because of the revolutionary history of it, the fact that, you know, it has always carried the history of like, you know, where Salah ad-Din defeated the Crusaders. And I think that in the 36 to 39 revolts, it also played a strategic role in that. And so it was completely depopulated. And so we went there and we spent ages trying to find it because it's like so hard to find because it's not on any map anymore. We found like an old map in Jerusalem that still had Hittin on it, and we're like old school trying to like, you know, use this like old map to try and find it. By the time we found it, like the sun was setting and we hardly had like 30 minutes to like actually like look around in sunlight. And you couldn't tell that like a village used to be there. It was completely kind of, there was some ruins of an old masjid, like kind of an old mosque. And the time I went back after that, we connected with a family member who now lives in Aylabun, but is originally from there. And he told us that on Nakba Day every year, everyone that's originally from from Hittin goes and does like a picnic outside of the mosque. Which I didn't know, because it's so hard to tell, like, you know, what that a village used to be there. So yeah, it's quite different. Tarshiha, the reason that it's still standing is because they built a settlement next to it, and basically they call it Ma'lot Tarshiha, which is basically they've like attached the name of the settlement to the name of Tarshiha,
like
and
Tel Aviv Yafa,
and like Judaized it. Yeah, exactly, like Tel Aviv Yafa. And Hittin is like there's nothing there. So it was very different experiences of the different ways that Zionism has ethnically cleansed our villages.
When you were talking there specifically about the story of the roundabout, you remind me of that scene from the television show Taghriba. Have you guys seen Taghriba?
Yeah.
Where the son, who was played by Hatem Ali, I think it was, who's not Hatem Ali. No, I'm mistaken. He's played by the director.
Yeah.
The red hair.
Yeah.
He's forced from his mother, and they both go in different directions. One goes into the 48 territories, and the other is forced to go to the West Bank. And then there's that scene towards the end where he finally is able to find his way back to his mother in the 48 territories.
Yeah.
And just that the fact that, because when they left, he was still a child.
Yeah.
And then he was a grown man when he returned.
Yeah.
And for Palestinians to be ripped from their families, ripped from their kind of natural state of being, and to have to live these lives away from each other, away from their homes, and then the story of finding their way back, it really is, as you were saying, it's really a heartwarming story.
Yeah, and like because we're Palestinian Syrian, like a lot of our family stayed in Syria. Like my grandparents ended up moving to Bahrain, but like a lot of our family stayed in Syria and stayed in Aleppo. And so when the Syria war broke out, a lot of them ended up, you know, becoming refugees a second time over, and a lot of them ended up in Germany and got German citizenship. And only when they got German citizenship did they visit Palestine for the first time. And my cousins in 48 were like, if they didn't have German citizenship, we would have never, ever met them. Yeah. And so it's like back to the point you were talking about in terms of like, you know, a good thing about, quote unquote, good thing about being in exile is that you get to meet, you know, Palestinians from everywhere, and it's only in exile that, because of the project of Zionism, it's only in exile that we're able to meet. Like when the first maybe couple of weeks after I moved to London, I went to this like thing called a Sumud Circle that was organized, and it was, you know, Palestinian only space, and it was for Palestinians no matter where you're from. And there was like Palestinians from 48 and Palestinians from Gaza. And, you know, even though, you know, it's literally like Gaza and 48 are like so close to each other, there are people from 48 that were in the Sumud Circle that like, this is the first time I've ever met someone from Gaza, and we're in London. So it's like, yeah, really goes to show how like even Palestine, as small as it is, how the project of Zionism has chopped up and fragmented the region, and the not just the region but also Palestine, it like from the river to the sea, and how it's only in, you know, exile that we're able to meet people from areas, because of the ways that checkpoints and border walls and all of these things have fragmented or attempt to fragment us.
Well, I think they've been successful. Unfortunately, they've been successful. I mean, today you find a lot of people referring to Palestinians in Gaza as just Gazans.
Yeah.
Right. And there is a fundamental difference in how they experience their Palestinianness, or just living. And Palestinians in the West Bank have struggles, but they live a certain way in the 48 territories, and you've got Lebanese camps and Syrian camps, and those who live in the diaspora, either in the Middle East or here in the West. And unfortunately, it's kind of created a hierarchy of oppression. And we see, obviously, with the top of the hierarchy is Gaza. And today, I don't know, the people of Gaza, any kind of, not ill will, but any negative sentiment they hold to the rest of the Palestinians for, I'm not going to say allowing, because, you know, it's difficult to put the blame on the Palestinians for something that Israel's doing,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
for just going on and living life
Yeah.
as the people of Gaza are being decimated.
Yeah.
It's really an unfortunate state of being. But the fragmentation, unfortunately, I think has succeeded in a way. And I'm not sure how we can move past it. Maybe that's a bit negative of me, but I don't know. Maybe you guys have some thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, like, the first time I met someone from Mukhaymat Lebanon was in London. Like, you talking about that person that's never met someone from Gaza before because they're from 48. And, like, I think that quite often, actually, when you meet people from, like, the camps in Lebanon, there's, like, you know, like the history of what happened in Lebanon is obviously, like, so horrific, like the massacres and Sabra and Shatila, the destruction of, like, entire refugee camps, like Tell Zatar, like that history is, like, also really erased. And like my mom was studying in university, like, when not just the civil, like the invasion of the Zionist entities invasion of Lebanon, but then the war of the camps and, like, all the massacres that were happening after that, like, was taking place. And there was also this, like, I guess at the time in the hierarchy of oppression, like the Palestinians in Lebanon were, like, at the top of the hierarchy. And I think, like, actually, like, I'm not saying that, like, we're not, like, recognizing this, but I think, like, I was reading about how the Zionist entity, like, what the occupation is trying to enforce in Gaza is, like, kind of is well, now it's, like, obviously different, but, like, a few months ago, like, what they've been trying to enforce before this, like, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was this, like, tribal, like, structure where, like, they arm the gangs that, like, then can control the aid. And, like, they want us to, like, lose any form of, like, national consciousness, and that's the project. And I agree that, like, obviously our reality is so fragmented, and, like a few, like, with the beginning of the attacks on Iran, the entirety of the West Bank was basically shut down and locked down, and any kind of movement between different cities and different villages has been blocked. And that's because obviously any connectivity is, like, a threat, like any possibility for movement and space to, like, rise up is such a threat in this, like, moment for them. But I wouldn't say that, like, it's been completely, I would argue that it's not been completely successful. Like, I think, like, we obviously see all the time, like, in social media and popular discourse, like, oh, like, this accent and, like, this attitude, or, like, these people are stingy and these people are generous, or, like, whatever. And, like, the stereotypes of, like, certain parts being, like posher and, like, whatever. But I think there's a difference between that and between, like, ultimately every person that I've met, like, who, like, has lived at a certain point in the West Bank that I've met here knows that, like, yes, we're, like, you know, people were using the phrase of, like, ma'amu b'dorhum, like, inno ma'amu, but it's, like, why have they not? Because, like, in the aftermath of 2021, like, there was a systematic project to destroy any potential for, like, uprising in the West Bank. Like, we need to ultimately, like, we just need to remember, like, maybe this sounds a bit idealistic, but I actually don't think it is. Like, I do think that, like, the large majority of the Palestinian people, like, understand that the reality is the way it is because of the enemy, and not because, like, you know, we are willingly abandoning, like, the people of Gaza. But obviously when we see, like, there were a few weeks ago, there was, like, that scene of, like, the mall in Ramallah that, like, had a celebration or something. It created, like, huge controversy. Like, then we need to obviously understand, like, you know, this is, like, I guess, the social and cultural reality that the PA creates, like, in Palestine, like, these distractions, like, that, like, we're experiencing in, like, obviously very different context, but, like, the distractions that Jeanine was talking about, like, in the West, like, like, you know, building your career and, you know, going on holiday or whatever, like the things that people do in the West, and that obviously all of us like in the West like have access to in one way or another. Like, yeah, I guess yeah. And again, I haven't been to Palestine, so like it's different, but I do think that like, I would say that like that division hasn't been successful. Like ultimately we're gonna have to deal with the consequences and like think about like as a people, how are we going to show up for like how this plays out? Like what is the reality? Like when in in September last year, we launched a fundraiser like in the PYM called the People Stand with Gaza. And the idea was, okay, if there's 1 million fundraisers, rightly so, and there should be more for Gaza, but there's a particular framework of like understanding the historic role that the Palestinian diaspora has played in fostering the steadfastness of the people on the ground, like ta'ziz sumud al-nas ala al-ard, because it's a different quality of struggle. Like it's just completely different reality of struggle. And I think like those are the questions we should be asking ourselves. Like how can we materially contribute to improving the conditions of the people in Gaza, the people from Gaza and Egypt now who are facing like extremely dire conditions as well. Like I think, yeah, that's kind of like how I'm thinking about it and how we try to think about it in the PYM. Because giving space to that fragmentation and like the tribalism that they want to see amongst us is like exactly like what the enemy wants us to do, you know?
Now the question is, who's the enemy?
The enemy, yes, good question. I mean, the enemy is obviously the Zionist entity, but also, you know, any force in the region that like extends the interests of the enemy. And so like when we think about, you know, governments in the region, like Arab governments in the region that have acted against the interests of their people and promote the Zionist project, whether it's in Jordan, Egypt, but also, you know, the role that the Palestinian Authority has played since the beginning of the genocide in stifling any form of resistance to the Zionist entity in collaborating over the last few years to destroy like any infrastructure that was being built to resist the Zionist project in the West Bank. And obviously, ultimately, who funds these projects, who gives the political cover to these projects, who ensures, whose interests are they serving? Obviously, the United States of America. So, like, that's how we kind of think about the enemy, yeah. And this government, the British government, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Walid Daqqa talks about, like in Searing of Consciousness, like Walid Daqqa talks about this like attempt to like fragment the collective consciousness of the Palestinian people. And I think that like when you try and like when you create different material conditions on the ground for different types of Palestinian, whether it's like Palestinians in diaspora or Palestinians in 48 or Palestinians in Gaza, what that ultimately does is it means that because of the different material realities that it creates like different understandings maybe of the contemporary nature of the Palestinian cause, the tactics that might be useful in like confronting Zionism, maybe a vision for liberation might look different if your material conditions are different. And so it's almost like an attempt to try and fragment us so that we can't think together, so that we can't think about strategies and tactics and like what a liberated Palestine might look like in a way that is actually collective. And I think that one of the things that we have to our advantage in the diaspora and in the West is that we have the space and the room and the ability to actually be able to think through these questions and to think these things through. And I think we need to take that responsibility very seriously, and not think that because we're in the diaspora and because we're far removed and because we're not on the ground, therefore we don't have responsibility and accountability to our national liberation struggle. On the contrary, we have a certain set of like advantages, skills, tactics, tools available to us. And especially, you know, in the aftermath of October 7th and 20 months of genocide, when historically, or at least in recent history, Gaza has always been the cradle of our struggle. In the aftermath of the complete destruction of Gaza, we need to step up to the role that we have to play in the diaspora in this next phase of our struggle. And so I think that's really important. I also think your question, Faris, is like, for me, it's not that they've been successful in fragmenting us. For me, they've been successful in depoliticizing us. Like, I think that for me, the real like core of the issue is that, like, I think a lot of Palestinians have taken this whole thing of like existence is resistance like a bit too literally. And what I mean by that is I think that just by being Palestinian, that is enough. And I think that there's a lot of Palestinians that, you know, obviously like cultural production, obviously like our food and our culture and our heritage, all of that is really, really important. But when you divorce that from politics and when you divorce that from what it means to be Palestinian on a political level, you create almost like an apathy of the fact that, you know, I'm Palestinian, and the fact that I do dabka and I cook Palestinian food at home for my family, and the fact that I, you know, I speak Arabic at home and all of these sorts of things, that's enough, because existence is resistance. But it's not. Like, actually being Palestinian is a political identity, and we have a responsibility to embody the political nature of the Palestinian identity. And like, yes, existence is resistance, but also resistance is existence. Like, we can't continue to exist and practice those things if we're not also resisting and organizing and taking up the responsibility that we have for our national liberation struggle from within the diaspora. And so I think that, like, actually, like, what they've been successful in doing is depoliticizing us and making us think that we don't have power. And therefore, the only thing left for us to do is to perform being Palestinian, when actually we can like organize from within the diaspora. And so I think that, I think that's actually like the root cause of what you're describing, rather than like fragmentation necessarily. Not that they're mutually exclusive, but just,
Well, that brings me on nicely to our next topic, which is the PYM, the Palestinian Youth Movement. Can you quickly describe or summarize what PYM actually is?
You should.
I should. Okay, so the Palestinian Youth Movement is the largest organization of Palestinian Arab youth in the diaspora, fighting for the liberation of our homeland. It is, we have chapters across the US, Canada, and Britain, and we're also in coalition with different Palestinian-led organizations in Italy and in Belgium and in France and Portugal and other places in Europe. And the PYM really understands our role as responding to the post-Oslo moment and the stripping of Palestinian youth and youth in the diaspora from the historic role that we've always played in our national liberation struggles. So, you know, the General Union of Palestinian Students and the role that youth have always played in our national liberation struggle, that was robbed from us with the increased NGOization, with transferring the Palestinian liberation struggle from a revolutionary national liberation project to a state building project. And we exist to really assume responsibility for our national liberation struggle from within the diaspora, and to, raise the consciousness of other Arab youth in the diaspora to understand the role that we have, the political role that we have to play from within the diaspora in our national liberation struggle. So that's kind of like at a high level what the PYM is, and we kind of understand our work in a few different kind of fronts. The first is communal. It's really the backbone of everything we do. And that's essentially things that are community facing. So, you know, serving our community, being embedded in our community, understanding that you are a base building organization, and what that means is that we need to understand our role as primarily serving the interests of the Palestinian Arab community in the places in which we're living and organizing. The second is kind of like joint struggle, we call it. So working with other struggles in the places in which we're organizing that are also fighting against the same enemy as us. So here, for example, like we have, a strong relationship with organizations like Nijam Manouche, that are kind of South Asian organizations fighting for local struggles against things like gentrification. We've been like trying to proactively build in North Kensington around where Grenfell happened, and thinking about how we can build with other kind of local struggles in the places in which we're organizing. And then obviously the student front of our work. So understanding the campus is a really important site of struggle. And so those are kinds of the three fronts of work. And we basically try and build up relationships with power in those fronts to be able to confront Zionism from within the different places in which we're organizing.
You mentioned liberation a few times there. What does liberation look like for the PYM, if it has a form?
Yeah, I mean, like we believe in the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. And yeah, we believe, we are very explicit in our position about the PA. We believe in, a Palestine for Palestinian people and not for the Palestinian Authority. And, we don't capitulate with an understanding of two-state. That's not something that we, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I guess like at the beginning we spoke a little bit about our Arab membership and just like thinking about like the dismantling of the Zionist project, what the consequences would that be for the entire region, and like, something that maybe like we don't think about as much anymore because of, all the wars that have been waged on the Middle East in the last like 30, well, for like, I don't know, like 2 centuries, but like especially in the last 30 years is, the destruction of the sovereignty of the region. And what would like sovereign Palestine look like? What would that mean for like countries like Egypt and Jordan and like the entire region, obviously. So those are some of the things that we think about in relation to what a liberated region as well would look like. Yeah.
Up until mid 2010s, I was one of those who believed that liberation in the wider region would eventually cause a liberation in Palestine.
Yeah.
But, post 2013, 15, that kind of changed. What's it like for you guys?
I mean, I agree. Like, I feel like, the liberation of Palestine and the weakening of, or the destruction of Zionism and the weakening of imperialism in our region will have ramifications for the entire region. And I think that's why a lot of non-Palestinian Arab members of the PYM feel such a responsibility and have found a political home in the PYM, because they see the project of destroying Zionism and the project of liberation of Palestine as something that is in their material interest and something that they have a stake in. So, I think, the Arab character of our organization and of our movement almost like indicates or like presupposes kind of what you're saying. Yeah.
I think also like, this has always been like a question maybe for the Palestinian movement, like historically as well, like how, like the road to Jerusalem, is it through, how do you get there from Jerusalem to the Arab region or from the region to Jerusalem? And I think it's like just, it's obviously so connected. And like we saw how in the immediate aftermath of, October 7th and like the struggle to hold on to Gaza, like since the beginning of the genocide, like the impact that it's had on like people's consciousness everywhere across the region, like that counts for something, even if we're not seeing the immediate impact of it. But I think it's difficult to say like what's going to happen first, but for sure, like everyone in the region and all of us have a responsibility to keep chipping away at like Zionism. And, you know, especially here in Britain, like obviously like no need to recount like the history, but like our role in, you know, isolating Zionism and ensuring that like the pariah status that the Zionist entity has like is cemented like in this country. Like the Palestine movement has never been so mass in Britain as a whole, not even only in our community. And yeah, we don't know, like all of this obviously contributes to something, but yeah.
What would you say are the kinds of actions that PYM undertakes in order to help achieve this goal?
I mean, we exercise a lot of different tools and tactics. So one thing that is like, I guess, like underpinning everything is the importance of just like organizing our community and making sure that there is like that Arab youth in London, in the immediate sense, but also across the country, like are stepping up and playing that role, because ultimately like we can exercise power if we're organized, if we're like building relationships and across different sectors and different parts of society in the country. And that's kind of like the philosophy, I guess, that underpins everything. But how that looks, or like what kinds of work like we do that by building up this like capacity, can take up like a cultural form, can take up things like campaigns, so like for example, like Jeanine mentioned, we are organizing in North Kensington, and one thing that we did last year was we painted this mural in May during the week of the Nakba commemoration last year, and earlier in this year it was defaced. And during that period we built a lot of relationships in the community. We were able to turn out the community and like do some like political education and like activities, cultural activities and things like that in addition to the painting. But we also know, for example, that like RBKC Council is like very invested, very complicit in arms companies, and like there's a potential for that like community building to be translated into like a campaign. Because like what we also see is that like local campaigns, like there are usually like a core group of people that are really, you know, motivated, are targeting the council, but you need like to actually organize like a significant amount of the community to be able to like win. But then also we've taken up like the MERS campaign, because obviously the central demand of the Palestine movement in Britain has been for an arms embargo, and we have seen like the successes of lots of different campaigns against different arms manufacturers, especially like Palestine Action's campaign against Elbit. And we thought about like how can we contribute to this like arms embargo demand, and how can we challenge the fact that we've seen basically like Western governments like just refusing this demand. So we like kind of introduced this idea of like a people's arms embargo, as in like how can we enforce an arms embargo from below. And we did some research and basically concluded that it would be strategic to pursue a logistics company, because a logistics company like Maersk is responsible for transporting parts from a lot of different arms manufacturers. And so it's a kind of a common denominator that if you delay a shipment, or if you're able to stop a shipment, or if you disrupt like the shipping route of Maersk, you're interrupting the supply chain in a way that hits a lot of different arms manufacturers. And Maersk is also, it's a Danish company. It's like one of the biggest, it's the second biggest logistics company. So it's like a sector leader. So if a decision is taken up by Maersk, the sector tends to follow. So for example, when, you know, the Yemeni resistance was like targeting ships in the Red Sea, Maersk was one of the first companies to like change route out of the Red Sea. And a lot of logistics companies followed. So we think if we can get Maersk to, you know, if we can leverage enough power against Maersk and they concede in some ways around, I mean, obviously the demand is for them to cut ties completely with genocide, to end any shipments of arms to the Zionist entity. But whatever precedent they take, it is very likely that other logistics companies will follow suit. So that's kind of the thinking. And
is this a global campaign?
This is an international campaign, yeah. And it's being taken up across North America, in Europe, in Britain, and in Australia, and I think in some parts of North Africa, especially Morocco, you might have seen like mass protests heading to the ports in Tangier and Tanja against the shipments of arms. And I think I actually think like the campaign expresses like what PYM's vision for confronting Zionism is really well, because one of the things that we talk about is like, you know, the Palestine movement strength is like, it's so mass. Like there's millions of people that have been on protest. There are millions of people that practice boycotts in their day-to-day lives. There's millions of people that are parts of like different groups, and how can we like leverage that against to serve the arms embargo demand? And because Maersk is like such an international player, like everyone's seen a Maersk shipping container like probably drive by at some point. They're everywhere, but so is the Palestine movement. And so we've actually at different points been able to follow, like recently there was a shipment, right, that came out of America from Houston to New Jersey. There was a protest at Houston, and then New Jersey, it then went to London, and where did it go? London, and then...
Yeah, I can't...
There's
been a few, yeah.
Yes, yeah. There's been a few. But the idea is that like these shipping routes, like we've been able to essentially exercise pressure against Maersk because we've been able to mobilize at lots of different points. And ultimately what has that resulted in is Maersk having to change its shipping routes, especially in the Mediterranean, where it no longer docks in Algeciras, which is like a really big port in Spain, and it has now been forced to dock in Morocco. But obviously we know the masses and the Arab people in Morocco are obviously in solidarity with Palestine, and so that creates like, you know, a contradiction there, that the people are obviously unhappy, the workers are refusing to handle the goods, and then it creates delays and it slows down the supply chain. And what we're now seeing also is that France recently, trade unions in France have basically declared that they won't be handling goods military goods being shipped on these liners. And so ultimately, probably what we're going to see is that these shipments are going to have to dock along the ports of North Africa. And so we see how, you know, these Arab regimes that are obviously not representative of their people's will are going to be facilitating the shipment of weapons. And in Europe, where like there is actually like an organized movement against, not to say that there isn't, you know, we see this in the convoy and stuff, but you know, this is the reality that like this campaign has been able to generate. And yeah.
And I think the other thing with the campaign is that like it shows the importance of like employing a diversity of tactics. Mm-hmm. So the first Maersk ship that got turned away was actually turned away from the port of Algeciras in Spain, like Yasmin said. And basically what happened was we put out a research report and sent a briefing to the Spanish government that basically said like, because the Spanish government had said they had an arms embargo. And so this briefing was like, did you know that like Maersk is like knowingly flouting your arms embargo, and they're about to send a shipment of these of military cargo to the port of Algeciras. The Spanish government said they were gonna investigate it. They investigated it. They found out it was true, and they rejected those two ships from being able to dock, and that's why Maersk has now rerouted. And then that same shipment went to Tangier. And in Tangier, like a lot of workers refused to work the ship, and like thousands of people came to the streets and protested. And so you can see like the research was important in terms of like illuminating the shipment. The diplomatic route was important because it was the Spanish government that turned the ship away. It was then the masses in Morocco that came out and like showed that we are not, you know, we're refusing this shipment. And it was the workers that refused to handle the cargo. So you've got a labor strategy, you've got a mass mobilization, you've got diplomatic, you've got research. So you can see this campaign also is an example of just how important it is to be able to have lots of different tactics and levers that you can pull, and knowing when to, pull different levers at different times to be able to exert pressure. And so I think it's also a really good example of this idea that, not one way works, and we're going to need to have to think strategically and in a way that's really agile and flexible to be able to maneuver in a way that's going to create pressure on Maersk.
I've seen a lot of videos coming from America, especially in regards to Maersk and protests and whatnot, but I don't feel like I've seen, at least on social media, it doesn't seem like there's much activity in Europe, at least not as much as America. Is there a reason to why it seems as though the American branch or American chapter is a lot more active?
I actually think it's the opposite. I mean, so like in February, we were in Copenhagen, and there was like a huge action that like Greta Thunberg was at, and they like shut down Maersk HQ in Denmark. So that was like really huge action that made news headlines. We had the wins in Spain with the shipments being turned around. And in Britain, we've done 2 actions now at the Maidenhead office of Maersk, where we, the second time we completely shut down the office for the day. Our comrades in Youth Front for Palestine in the north have also done a couple of office crashes in Manchester or in Liverpool of the Maersk office. In Liverpool, so
in the Geneva.
Oh yeah, and
in Italy.
Yeah, in Italy.
In Italy, I want to say October last year, November last year. Like these trade unions that like organize port workers also did like a similar kind of port shutdown to like what the workers in Morocco were able to do, where they like didn't handle military goods. But I think like maybe like what you're speaking to is the fact that like PYM in North America has been around for longer, so the organization has existed for like 10 years, I guess, now in North America, and so they have chapters across the US and Canada, and so it's like we're in like as an international organization, like Britain, we started the chapter in 2021, actually in the immediate aftermath of the Unity uprising, like the Sheikh Jarrah uprising, and a lot of us were either in the Solidarity movement or in the student movement, and were graduating or just like had frustrations with the Solidarity movement. Not that like the Solidarity movement obviously isn't important, it plays like a really vital role, but we wanted like an organization that was like, I guess, Palestinian and Arab in character.
Why is it important for it to be Palestinian and Arab in character?
I mean, I think that, Jeanine kind of alluded to this a little bit when you spoke about the history of the PYM and like the moment we come out of in response to Oslo and stuff. But I think like historically, even in the West, like in different countries in Europe, in America, there were always Palestinian or Arab organizations that were embedded in the organizing for Palestine. And obviously there are still like big community organizations in London that like play an important role in the movement, but it's really important for there to be like a political voice that is looking at the developments on the ground in Palestine and is able to translate an analysis that is like reflective of like what's happening on the ground. And part of like the Oslo project, especially for the diaspora, was to completely sever any connection between the political reality on the ground and like how Palestinians and Arabs in the West related to that. And so what we often talk about is that we're not in solidarity with people in Palestine and Gaza. We're on a different front line of the struggle. Like it's our struggle as well. Like we have a responsibility to take it up. And I think that has become less prevalent since the genocide began. I think the framework, the solidarity framework in the Arab community amongst the Arab youth has like waned massively. But I think for a very long time, the solidarity framework was very dominant, and it was because of like the consequences of Oslo and, destroying the institutions that like Palestinian Arab youth would have been a part of. And I think just generally like there aren't a lot of political spaces for Arab and Palestinian youth in London, but also in a lot of places in the West. So that was kind of the rationale for why we set up. And like, yeah, does that kind of explain like why specifically Arab and Palestinian, not
Maybe.
just solidarity?
I guess my follow-up question is like,
Yeah.
how does it fit then into the broader, maybe not pro-Palestine, but Palestinian kind of fabric? If
Yeah.
you will? How does POM fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we think about our role is kind of, so we think about ourselves as like grassroots, as independent, as wanting to, look at like the different traditions historically and today in the Palestine movement and learn from the experiences of our struggle. And like something we talk about a lot is this concept of tarakum, and how like what resistance our people have been able to exercise has been the result of like years and years of decades of like struggle and experience. And so when we think about like kind of what we want to do here is we want to, we need an organization because we want Palestinian and Arab youth to always assume that role. Like if you look at like, the intifadas, like Palestinian youth were always on the front lines of that fight. But we want to like have a place where we can accumulate those lessons, like reflect together, analyze what's happening on the ground, study together, and then also be out in our community, out in different spaces, like whether it's, amongst the student movement, whether it's amongst different, like, different areas of struggle, whether it's like thinking about, the, like, I guess, yeah, like cultural influence, like media influence, putting a Palestinian narrative out there is like a bit, it's distinct from like a solidarity narrative. Like there's a difference in like how you articulate the struggle when you're looking to how, analysts and thinkers on the ground in Palestine are thinking about the reality and playing an important role in translating that. Like a really good example is a novel that we translated by the former political prisoner Wissam Rafidi, and it's called Al-Aqanim al-Thalatha, The Trinity of Fundamentals. And the novel is kind of like a fictionalized narrative of his experience in hiding in the years leading up to the first Intifada. And he wrote it while he was in the prisons. And like the prisoner struggle is like something that we try to bring to light. But like, also Jeanine mentioned Walid Daqqa. Like I think that knowledge production, that like analysis, that experience, like is something that generally Palestinian and Arab organizations tend to like introduce into the movement, I would say. And so I think that's kind of like a good example of how we think about that role. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. And I think like that's, yeah. And we want to be connected. Like we want to be connected to like, when we went to Lebanon, we met with a lot of like youth centers, with a lot of community centers in the different camps. And we quite often host, well, during the genocide that maybe like was difficult, but like at certain points we did, but also before that we want to host like webinars at the People's Conference that they organized last year. We want to bring people from the region and have some of that analysis in the West, because also there's a language barrier as well, like with, the authors maybe, or like the political analysis that we hear is like tends to be only produced in English, and there's like a wealth of knowledge in Arabic that we want to bring to the movement.
And I think we also like, there is like it is important for there to be like an ecosystem of like pro-Palestinian organizations in Britain that are all fighting for the liberation of Palestine. And I think that like all these organizations, including the Solidarity Movement, have like a really important role to play. But what we identified was there was an absence for Arab youth who really wanted to, who didn't really relate to, I organized in the Solidarity Movement for a long time before I joined the PYM, and there's a lot of Arab youth who felt like, the Solidarity Movement doesn't really resonate with them, and they are coming out of the student movement and don't really know, what to do next. They want to continue organizing, and I think PYM has provided a political home for those youth, and I think that, we're not naive in thinking that like we as PYM can do everything. Like we do work in partnership with like a lot of other like really great organizations in Britain that are doing really great work. It's just that there was like an absence and like a vacuum for an Arab youth organization, and we wanted to fill that.
I mean, I feel like there are Arab or Palestinian youth organizations that exist, whether in the UK or abroad. So maybe the question is that, or rather, maybe it's an ideological kind of space to provide a space for kind of leftist as opposed to maybe nationalist dominant spaces, or maybe Islamic dominant spaces. Might that be the case?
I don't know. I feel like there's a lot, like PYM is like a broad church. There's like a lot of people that come from like all different walks of life that have like ended up in the PYM. So I don't think necessarily it was for us, at least in building the PYM. I don't think it was an ideological question. I think it was more a question of, I mean, you were there like right at the beginning. I think it was more a question of like the fact that there isn't anything that exists that's like international.
Yeah. And I think also like I was in the student movement, and then we're seeing what PYM was doing in North America during the Unity Intifada, and it was like really great. Like they were one of the biggest like mobilizing forces on the street. There was also like a lot of political education. There was like this whole course on like Oslo that was being done, and we wanted that. Like we wanted, a space for that discussion. And I think also something that we really wanted was like a space where like youth can lead as well. Like there are lots of and lead in like a political way. Like I do think there's a lot of like Arab like maybe groups and spaces, but I don't know to what extent there's like actually like an organizing space, like an organizing political space for like youth in London. I think like since the genocide, there's definitely been more and more spaces and groups that have popped up, and we mobilize with them a lot as well. But I think that was like the experience in like graduating from the student movement, and then I was also a SAB. So I was working in a student union, and I was connected to a lot of different, like I think in the student movement actually, like when I was a student anyway, there was like good presence of like Arab and Muslim youth like leading, but also we know what happened in the student movement. Like that's a whole other story. But yeah, like I do think that at the time it didn't feel like there was a space where I felt like, okay, I could go there. And I think like like I said, like we look at like the history of the Palestinian struggle like in all its traditions, like in a serious way. Like we look to the prisoners movement, we look to the experience in Lebanon, we look at the uprising in Palestine, like the shifting of the struggle to like on the ground in Palestine, like what was happening in the 80s, like the shifts that happened in the Palestine movement, and we study all of it. And I think that's kind of like how we take up our role. And yeah.
Well, on that note, I think that's all we have time for today.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us, Yasmin, Jeanine. Hopefully you can join us again.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure, and we'd love to be back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.